So far, we've implemented a functionality that allows users to add songs to the playlist, and we replace the add button with a cancel button while the request is in progress. Right now, the cancel button doesn't do anything, so we're going to implement it using an abort controller. This is part of the DOM, and it's a standardized way of canceling asynchronous operations in progress, such as our fetch request. All we have to do is instantiate it, assign it to fetch, and finally call the abort method when we want to abort a request. I start by writing a cancel function and assigning it to the onClick handler for the cancel button. Let's now see how we might implement this. First, instantiate an abort controller. Then assign it to our fetch request. And finally, call the abort method inside cancel. As you can see, the abort controller exposes a signal property, and fetch accepts a signal property. Calling abort on the abort controller will send a signal to fetch, which will in turn abort the request and reject the promise with an abort error. We're catching all errors here, so we don't need to do anything special about this. Let's see if it works. I go to the browser, add a song, and click cancel. Nothing happens. So what am I doing wrong here? The problem is actually the way in which I'm creating the controller, and more specifically, that I'm creating it directly inside the component. If you go back to the component, you see that I'm instantiating it here, then assigning it to fetch here inside add, but that is also updating the state when it calls setRequestStatus, and as with any state update, that causes the component to be re-rendered, which in turn causes songadd to be called again. Now we have a fetch request started in the previous call to songadd, and the abort controller created in the same call is assigned to it. But since the re-render calls songadd again, a new abort controller is created, and this controller is different from the controller assigned to the fetch request, so it makes sense that calling abort on it will have no effect on the fetch request. We need a way to preserve the same abort controller instance between re-renders, and this is where refs and the useRef hook can help. The documentation describes useRef as a React hook that lets you reference a value that's not needed for rendering. So, just like the state, refs keep values between calls to the component, but unlike the state, changing the value doesn't cause a re-render. This makes them perfect for our abort controller, since you only need it to control the fetch request. So let's update our code to use refs. I start with renaming abort controller to abort controller ref, and then wrap the instance in useRef. useRef returns an object with a property called current, which holds the value assigned to the ref. In this case, current will be the abort controller we create when we call useRef for the first time. When the component is re-rendered and songadd is called for a second time, the value of current will stay the same since the ref is already initialized from a previous call. I'll make the change to point the fetch request to the ref's current property, and I'll make the same change inside cancel. Let's go back to the browser and see if this solved our problem. I'll add a song, then click cancel. The request was aborted, and we see the abort error we expect. It looks like it's working, but when I click the add button again, I'm getting an error saying that the request is aborted. You might see a different message depending on the browser you're using, but the cause is the same. Let's see why this is happening. Now that the abort controller is inside the ref, it's always going to be the same instance. If we call abort on it, not only does it send an abort signal to the fetch request, but it also gets marked as aborted from now on. Next time we call fetch, we're passing the same abort controller, which, if it's marked as aborted, aborts the fetch before it even begins. So we'll have to discard the abort controller after we're done using it, and create a new one for each request. The change should be easy. I just set current to null after calling abort, and next time songadd is called, if current is null, I'll instantiate a new abort controller. If you now head to the browser, add a song, click cancel, then add, and then cancel again, you can see the issue was resolved since we're now using a new abort controller after each cancel. With this change, we're done in terms of functionality, but I still want to show you an optimization we can make. Right now, we're initializing the ref with a new abort controller every time song_add is called, but once the ref is initialized, the initialization will not happen again. So when song_add is called again, the new abort controller we create is simply discarded. To fix this, I'll initialize the ref with null, and let the code that checks for null create a controller only if it's needed. Okay, I want to wrap up this introduction to refs by comparing them with the state. Both refs and the state can be used to persist values across re-renders, but there are a few important differences between them. First, the state is immutable. State values cannot be modified, and setting a new value completely replaces the old value. Refs, however, are mutable, and you're supposed to assign directly to the current property. Another important distinction is that a state update triggers a re-render, whereas changing the value of a ref's current property doesn't. That's why it's recommended to use refs for values that are not needed in the process of rendering, and state for the values that are part of what the user ends up seeing on the screen. And finally, React can use refs to give you direct access to the DOM elements it creates. We'll look at this shortly.